welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and just wanted to do a quick supplemental or bonus show following up on my interview with Dr. Shabir Ali yesterday on the numerical patterns found in the Quran, the various mathematical miracles or those numerical patterns that are found in the Quran, and that Dr. Shabir Ali thinks are proof that Islam is true because the Quran has these patterns and they were obviously not designed by human beings. So he thinks that they were designed by God or put in there by God as proof, attesting to the truth of Islam. And a couple things I wanted to say. So obviously, when I do interview shows, I don't typically do reviews or that sort of thing, or I'm not going to be critiquing what he said in terms of his case too much in that sort of thing, because I prefer that my guests, what they've said stands on their own. I was interviewing him. It wasn't a debate with him. So I'm going to let what he said stand for the most part, rather than refuting after the fact what he said. But there is something that I think is really important to add here as a bonus show, and that's kind of something that Shabir Ali wasn't informed about, and or wasn't ready to speak about in the debate. And I take responsibility for that. I should have let him know that, hey, I'd like to maybe do some research on specified complexity, and I'd like to look at that in light of your opening case, in light of some of the examples that you give. How does that match up to the criteria of specified complexity? But from what I sent him, I didn't do that. So my bad, that was my fault. Not a problem at all. But yeah, so I'll take an opportunity now to spend a bit of time just kind of re-explaining why I think specified complexity works and fits. And it's the way to tell if in fact these mathematical or numerical patterns in the Quran are in fact intelligently designed by Allah or God or something like that, or not, whether they can be attributed to random chance. Now, just a couple things to say in advance. So number one, I found it interesting, Shabir's answer that he doesn't think there are generalized criteria for identifying miracles in general. And that's interesting because I actually disagree with that. I think that there are, and I've kind of covered that myself. You can see on my blog, Miracles, Signs and Wonders Part 2, Identifying and Evaluating Miracles of God. But just in general, philosophers say there's three essential ingredients. You need to prove an event happened, whatever it is, prophecy, scientific foreknowledge, the resurrection, numerical patterns in the Quran, whatever the event is you're talking about that you're claiming is a miracle. Secondly, that event needs to be proven to be extraordinary or improbable or supernatural in some way, something like that. It's a non-ordinary or naturalistic event. Any of those would do, kind of thing. And then thirdly, you need to prove that it takes place within a context charged with religious significance or within a religious context. And I prefer within a religious authenticating context, whereby the intelligent agent can be reasonably identified as God, authenticating a given religion as being true and or the religion that he wants us to follow. So I think that there are general criteria. I outlined those in my 11 premise argument. Premise 8 outlines the criteria that I use. It's a table of criteria that I use to identify a miracle within the context of my 11 premise argument. And that's also included in this 21-page blog, where I talk about in detail what is specified complexity, how does that relate to my criteria for identifying a miracle, because believe it or not, I also think specified complexity is relevant to identifying miracles in general. I have kind of a bastardized version with my criteria of specified complexity to say, hey, these miracles, they are God-designed events for the purpose of authenticating a given religion. And I cover all of that in my blog or under my tab, my 11 premise argument. And that works in light of undue confusion. So that kind of relates to also another thing that was interesting is Satan. Well, how do we know it's God and not Satan and stuff like that? And I think that there is an answer for that. I think that is a good question that Shabir asked me back in the day. So basically the answer is undue confusion. God would not and could not allow Satan or any other power to unduly confuse us in the context of a miraculous event, identifiable miraculous event within the context of someone serving to attest to the truth of a religion. And, if as long as it's unique and it matches all criteria of my premise 8, then I argue that God would not allow that, because that would be undue confusion. And a maximally great being like God could not allow for undue confusion to occur. Therefore, we know it's not Satan, we know it's not aliens, we know it's not ghosts or demons or any other thing. It's God, either directly or indirectly. God has designed this event for the purpose of authenticating religion, and we can trust in that. So that's my take on that. Very briefly, it was interesting. Shabir disagreed and said he didn't think that there are criteria and that sort of thing, or that there is a way necessarily to an ironclad way, I think is what he meant, to adjudicate between Satan versus God events. I think I found it. So, but yeah, I won't get into that here, but I cover that in my 11 premise argument in a skeletal form, or I explain it in more detail in my 21-page blog write-up under identifying miracles and evaluating things miracles of God part 2. Okay, so what I'm here to do, specifically numerical patterns and specified complexity. That's what I want to deal with primarily here. So let me get into that. So from the beginning, awesome. So specified complexity, as I explained in the show, has 2 elements. Number 1, there has to be a specification. This just refers to a pattern that is, or description of an event that is independent from the event's occurrence, or it's what Dembski says, detachable from the event itself. So an example here that William Craig would give is the license plate saying Bob 1584. So let's say that Bob, it's his birthday. Bob was born January 5th, 1984. And he gets a car for his birthday. And on the license plate, it says Bob 1584. Well, in this case, there's a specified independent pattern, independent of him getting the car with that license plate on it. There's a specification because Bob was born January 5th, 1984. This is a pattern that's independent of it, of the event itself's occurrence. Secondly, you could have rolling a dice and getting the number 3. This would count as an independent pattern. Rolling the number 3 is a specification, or a specified pattern that's independent of the event's occurrence. And it's the same for any other thing. Or a final example would be picture a target that you shoot bows and arrows into with a bullseye and all of that. Well, in this case, the target is the specification. It provides that independent pattern that provides the context for how we interpret an event, where the arrow lands on it. In the bullseye, bingo, this guy's great. Oh, he's missed the board entirely. This guy sucks at shooting bows, shooting arrows and stuff like that. So with specification, there are 2 elements. So number 1, it has to have conditional independence, meaning that knowledge of the pattern itself can't affect the probability of the occurrence of the event. So these kind of relate to what Dembski calls fabrications, right? And we want to avoid fabrications. Those are different from specifications. Specifications are good patterns, good in the sense of helping us identify intelligent design, whereas fabrications are bad patterns. They're bad patterns because they don't help us in that way. They're more fudged or forced by some kind of malevolent agent or something. So the example here is self-fulfilling prophecy. So, I prophesy that I'm going to raise my hand. Oops, I raised my hand. Why? Because knowledge of that pattern that I've specified in advance that I'm going to raise my hand raised the probability that I'm going to raise my hand to say, see, I'm a prophet. I prophesied I was going to raise my hand, and I raised my hand. Well, really, that's not conditional independence in that way. The second one is what I mentioned in the show, tractability. And this relates, I think, to a lot of word count, numerical patterns and that sort of thing in the Quran. Tractability is a possible objection to certain numerical patterns in the Quran, and this would need to be overcome. And Shabir Ali, to his credit in the show, did give kind of a partial response to an objection in general based on tractability, where it's the event's occurrence must be indeterminate in terms of our deriving a given pattern. So this comes up a lot in Islam, right? So with these numerical patterns, Shabir himself admitted that, look, it's not like, hey, we have in mind 377, or we have in mind the multiple 7. There's going to be numerical patterns in the Quran that are multiples of 7, or that are related to the number 377, or Jesus and Adam are going to be mentioned the same number of times, and then we make that prediction, then we go and look. No, actually, it's after the fact. They find some of these patterns haphazardly. Sometimes they get errors, and it's trial and error type thing. Then they find it, and they go, there's this pattern or something. So that might be a problem in terms of tractability, because it's only after the event occurs, after they spot this pattern, that they go, oh yeah, well, there was this independent specified pattern the whole time. We always knew that Jesus and Adam were going to have the same number of mentions, or whatever the pattern is. So this is something you would need to prove. And like I said, I think Shabir Ali attempted to do this in his opening, at least to some extent, without knowing what specification was and that sort of thing. So, for example, one of the first things he did, there are two, with the numerical patterns in the Quran, Shabir Ali didn't present this in my show, but on other times he's presented, there are 5 categories, broad categories of numerical patterns in the Quran. So the first one are the word count type patterns, and he presented, so that's like, okay, the number of times Adam is mentioned is the same as the number of times Jesus is mentioned. Or you'll hear other ones like, oh, well, the word day in the Quran, that's mentioned 365 times. Whoa, perfect. Or the word month, that's mentioned 12 times. So these are what they classify word count, at least what I classify word count, numerical patterns. There's also multiples of 7, which is a lot of work was done by Cahill 7 that Shabir talked about. He used that category. There's also multiples of 19, numerical patterns related to the number 19. There's miscellaneous ones, which I don't think Shabir got into, that I noticed in the show last night. And then finally, there's the ones that I think personally are the most important. The symmetrical patterns of the Quran. So that's kind of, I gave the link to the symmetric book in the Noble Quran. These are the patterns that have me kind of agnostic and wondering if there's at least some of these ones are kind of ones that persuaded me, not so much the other categories of numerical patterns, the multiples of 7, 19, I don't find as convincing as these symmetrical type patterns, but that's just me showing you there. Okay, awesome. So anyways, you've got these patterns. And in terms of specification, right? So you want it to be the event, finding these patterns should be indeterminate with respect to understanding or discerning the pattern itself. And yeah, what I was saying, so Shabir, in his opening case, he presented Quranic verses that seem to hint that the number 7 or multiples of 7 is important, or same deal with the number 19 or multiples of 19. This is specified in advance before anyone even knew that there were numerical patterns related to multiples of 7 or multiples of 19 in the Quran. For example, we didn't even start discovering this until 1974. Shabir was saying. So in that case, that would pass these tractability things. Now, obviously, there's going to be debates. Yeah, but is that really a specification? I mean, even Shabir himself admitted, well, the verses where it's talking about 19, it's not specifying that you're going to find patterns in multiples of 19 in the Quran. It's talking about number of angels or something like that. So there could be some debate about whether these verses that Shabir is using actually specify these patterns or not. And there's same deal with the multiples of 7 or any other thing. So you'll need to establish that this pattern is actually there. type deal first. But yeah, I hope that that clears it up in terms of specification and in general how that can relate to these numerical patterns in the Quran and what Muslims have to do. And I think sometimes there are some issues with tractability, and this a lot of times Christians will be skeptical of this, or even atheists and skeptics, on the basis of, yeah, but is this really tractable? Because you're running through these trials and errors, and you're stumbling upon a pattern, and then you're saying, aha, after the fact. Um, so it's kind of debatable in some cases as to whether these patterns, whether the events occurrence, the discovery of these patterns in the Quran actually are indeterminate with respect to saying, hey, this is a specified pattern. So that's something that I've seen Muslims and Shabir Ali himself address, but that's something you should know about. Okay, great. So let's get into the complexity criterion, because this is where statistical probabilities, formal calculations are important, and we have to do it properly, because the numerical patterns in the Quran, what are they? They are a statistical claim by nature. So you can't get away with just subjective probabilities. I think Robert White, or Robert in the show as my co-host, he brought up a great point of the problem of innumeracy, which I bring up to my first year students in critical thinking class under the fallacies and stuff like that. Human beings are horrible at estimating odds or understanding probabilities of and very large numbers and that sort of thing. So you might see something and you go, wow, that's incredible. But then actually statistically, when you calculate it, no, of course it would happen. And, Robert gave the birthday example, birthday illustration there. So yeah, so it's important that we follow the rules of mathematics. If we're going to make a mathematical claim that there are numerical patterns that were designed, then they have to be strictly statistically complex in the way that William Dembski lays out here. So that means that the probability of the event's occurrence has to be smaller than some kind of probability bound or threshold. And this brings me up to the next point. So number one, in all of the scholarship that I've seen on the numerical patterns in the Quran, none of the Muslim apologists have even attempted to calculate the localized probability band. So localized probability bound just means, what's that threshold below which we say it's impossible to occur by chance. Probabilities that are higher than that threshold, then we can attribute that to random chance processes or coincidence or something like that. And I've never seen any Muslims work on what the probability bound would have to be. So I have no idea I'm not a mathematician either. I have no idea what the localized probability bound would be. But whatever it is, it would have to be higher than the universal probability bound that William Dembski has mathematically proven is the case on a given assumption related to multiverses and stuff like that. But he says, look, there's this universal small probability law. Anything that is 1 divided by 10 to the power of 150, or 10 to the power of negative 150 or less or smaller in terms of a probability occurrence, impossible to occur by chance, and therefore you've proven intelligent design. So if these numerical patterns as a cumulative case, if the probabilities of those are less than 1 chance in 10 to the power of 150, then you can't use random coincidence or chance as a naturalistic explanation. They had to be intelligently designed. So that's sort of how the probability bound works. Okay, so then the next part is, well, how do we calculate what the probability of these numerical patterns are? And as I said, with the probability bounds, I've never seen a Muslim tackle that question in any of the literature. Even Cahill 7, he deals with multiples of 7, and I linked to his great book. I mean, he does great work and that sort of thing in his book that I'm looking at right now. So yeah, I definitely say check it out. And he provides some numbers, but he doesn't discuss anything about probability bounds. Sorry. And also in terms of the probability itself. So how do we calculate what that is? And this is where I said what we need is these, what Richard Dawkins calls these quote unquote saturated probability. This is what you need to compare and contrast to that probability bound. And in order to get that, so we have this formula, I've kind of, so 1 minus p, so the probability to the power of n, and this refers to your n refers to your probabilistic resources, and p is just your straightforward probability, and or with specificational resources. So what the way this works, so to give you an example here, the simple probability would be, let's say I ask you, what is the probability that you will roll the specified pattern of 3 on a single die, a normal die, if you roll 3 times, and you'll get 3 times out of those rolls. So you roll a dice 3 times, and your specified result is you get 3 every single time. What is the probability of that? Well, as we know, in this case, P, the simple probability is the number of desired or specified outcomes divided by the total number of possible outcomes. So in this case, it's 1/6 times 1/6 on the second roll times 1/6 on the third roll. And that gives us a very small probability, 1 divided by 216. There's 216 possible outcomes when you roll a dice 3 times, and given there's 6 options. And we're only looking for 1 specified outcome, 3 times. We roll a number 3 times on each roll of the dice. So that's very improbable. There's only a 0.00463 or 0.4, let's say 0.5, 0.5% probability that we will have obtained this result. And this is the simple probability, the P, that we would put in this equation. But now we also need to assess those probabilistic resources, both the replicational resources and the specificational resources. And that will change. That, depending on what that number is, that could increase the probability from 0.5% probability to a higher number. So what are these probabilistic resources? So in a nutshell, replicational resources are the number of trials, the number of times you get to achieve a given result. So for example, the replicational resources, this is why William Dembski doesn't like the teleological argument or is agnostic on the fine-tuning argument for the universe, for example, because maybe all scientists, atheists, skeptics, whatever you are, we all agree that it's immensely complex, improbable, way beyond the probability bound of 1 divided by 10 to the power of 150. It's way less than that, way smaller than that. Given one universe, what are the odds that we would observe the fine-tuning of the universe that we have? Extremely improbable, very, very, very improbable. But what atheists and skeptics like to do is they'll appeal to, well, yes, it's given that we only have one trial, it's extremely improbable to get the fine-tuning of the universe. But what if we add replicational resources? The multiverse. We don't just have one universe, we've got 500 universes, or 10 to the power of 500 universes, or perhaps an infinite number of multiverses. And given those, but anyways, you get the point, right? Once we add replication, once we add to this n figure, this to the power of n, this will raise the probability of getting the event's occurrence, the probability that our universe will be fine-tuned. Given there's 500 universes, or 10 to the power of 500 universes, is much higher than just the fine-tuning of one universe. There's only exists one universe alone. So that's how these work. And it's the same with rolling the dice, right? So let's say we have the same specified pattern. We want to get 3 number 3s on the dice, given that we're rolling it. And we saw that that's only 0.5% or 0.46%, something like that. Well, let's say I get to roll the dice 6 times now. So I'm doubling the number of replicational resources. So n equals 2 in this case. So when you do the math, you can see it raises the probability. It's still very improbable. It's only less than a 1% chance, right? It's 0.92% probability, but that's much higher than the 0.463. It's almost doubled the probability, right? And that makes sense because we've doubled the number of chances that we're getting. And if you wanted to increase this to 3 replicational resources, you roll it 9 times and you want to get 3 threes out of those 9 rolls. Again, that will increase this. You plug in 3 here, and that will increase the probability accordingly based on your replicational resources. So hopefully that makes sense. And this kind of relates to the numerical patterns in the Quran. So Shabir Ali himself admitted that some of the numerical patterns are not universally found throughout the Quran. They appeal to specific parts in the Quran, or a specific chapter within the Quran, or specific people, or something like that. So they're specific to an individual instance of something, right? And without having a proper way to specify why you're specifying an individual chapter, or something, or an individual person, like why Jesus and Adam? Why not Jesus and Moses, or something like that? And obviously Shabir provides, well, the Quran says Jesus is like Adam or something. And that's his attempt to say, well, that's why we're specifying these two to be comparable and not Jesus and all of the other prophets mentioned in the Quran or something. Okay, so we had a bit of a technical glitch there. Just picking up from where we left off. Okay, so we were talking about the replicational resources in terms of the mathematical patterns in the Quran. So these are probabilistic resources. This represents the n in the equation of 1 minus p to the power of n. These are our replicational probabilistic resources. For example, and I gave the example of, let's say we can roll a dice 9 times, 6 times, or 9 times to get the result, the specified result of 3 threes. So we would plug in 2, or in the case of rolling the dice 9 times, we would plug in 3 probabilistic replicational resources here, and that will increase the probability accordingly. And it's the same within the Quran. Like you said, if there are certain mathematical patterns that are specific to specific verses or specific chapters or specific people, it's something that is a unique mathematical pattern that a Muslim has found. Well, if there's 114 chapters in the Quran, you have 114 replicational resources. Why is it this pattern just found in this specific chapter or this specific verse or this for these specific people? And you have to provide a reason via your addressing the specification criterion as to why you're singling out these people. Otherwise, you have all those replicational resources and it's not improbable at all or something like that. Additionally, in terms of replicational resources, this is really the Achilles heel for the Muslim mathematical patterns argument, I find, because look at someone like Cahill 7.7. Look at all these things. So, it talks about letter count, word counts, chapter counts, or verse counts and stuff like that. So they have these 4 different main ways, categories of things to find multiples of 7 in, right? So how many letters in the Quran? Tens of thousands. How many verses in the Quran? How many chapters in the Quran? 114. How many words or letters are in the Quran? And you can use different combinations. You can see, look how many replicational resources or different ways, as Cahill 7, the Muslim apologist who does a lot of work on the multiples of 7, says, and these are not definitive, but these are all of the different replicational resources that he has at his disposal to try and find mathematical patterns or multiples of 7. So yeah, you can see chapter number, verse number, and these can be combined in any possible way that leads to an outcome. So these are all replicational resources that are used. Same with the symmetrical patterns in the Quran. These are the category that I found the most persuasive, but just psychologically speaking, without the statistical numbers to back it up. But yeah, look at all of, so this is based on prime numbers, and then it's further divided by the sequence number and the number of homogeneous with respect to a prime sequence and verse numbers or something. So it's dividing the surahs and the ayat numbers, and in terms of their sequence number, they're homogeneous in light of a prime sequence. So there's layers of mathematical rules to find this symmetrical pattern in this case. And well, why not a different way? Look at all these ways, or different ways that provide the results that the Muslim wants here in this section. But how many ways are they not telling us about that didn't work? And these are what the replicational resources are all about. And that would raise the probability of finding any one of these patterns, and or a multiple of 7, just to keep it simple here. For that category, we have all these different ways of trying to find a multiple of 7. And we're not telling you about all the other ways that failed to find multiples of 7, and why we should care about using this way versus another way, other than, well, we tried it and we got a multiple of 7. So that's what we're talking about here with the replicational resources. There are so many available that Muslim apologists just don't tell you about at all. Going back to Cahill, so like, you know, Cahill 7's thing, he's the one that actually attaches probabilities and calculates some measure of probability to the mathematical patterns. That's one of the reasons I like his work, even though I don't find the multiples of 7 as persuasive myself. At least he attaches probabilities to them. And so, for example, with this one thing, Shabir Ali mentioned in the show, look, 70. So 1/7, the probability simpliciter of finding a multiple of 7 in the Quran is 1 divided by 7. And then in this little Basmala section, which Shabir talked about, to the power of 70, 1 divided by 7 times 1 divided by 7, because they found 70 multiples of 7 in this little chunk. And that equals this incredibly small number. It's still not lower than the universal probability bound. So we don't know how to interpret this probability, even if we take it at face value. Well, is that a small enough probability to determine a random chance can't account for it? We know that incredibly small probability events happen. And I would say here, there's not about 150 zeros here. So it's obviously not smaller than the universal probability bound. And we have no idea what a localized probability bound would be in the context of numerical patterns in the Quran to compare to this probability. So we don't even know, even taking this at face value, is this probability small enough? We don't have a clue. But there's the additional problem in, well, Cahill he's told us what P proper is, but he hasn't told us N. He hasn't told us how many replicational probabilistic resources we have, and then done the calculation, which will inevitably raise this probability. To what extent, again, I'm not a mathematician. I have no way of calculating it, but you get the point. It's going to be a lot higher than what we have here once we account in all of the replicational probabilistic resources. Okay, so next, what about specificational resources? So specificational resources, the example here, look, pretend everything's the same. We want those 3 3s, and we have 6 rolls of the dice. So probabilistic resources based on replicational resources are 2. But this time we add specification. So we could get 3 3s, or we could get 3 5s, or we could get 3 6s based on 6 rolls of the dice. So once again here, so we have our equation 1 minus, and then in brackets 1 minus, oh, this is different. It's not 1 specification out of 216 possible results. This time we're specifying 3 desired results divided by 216. So again, this is going to raise our probability. We have 3 specificational resources as opposed to just 1 that we had before, because now we have 3 results out of the 216 total that are a hit, that work. And then, so you can see that doubles the probability. It's up to over close to 3% now. And it's the same with the Quran. So how would specificational resources relate to the numerical patterns in the Quran? Well, something that Shabir Ali mentioned in the show is he kind of hinted at very briefly, well, look, it's not just multiples of 7. We also find multiples of 7 to the power of 2 or 7 to the power of 4 at times. So there's a 1 out of 49 chance for that, or there's a 1 out of whatever 7 to the power of 4 chance is, in order to find that. Let me actually just, whoa, that's so improbable. Now it's not just 7 divided by 7 times 1 divided by 7 times 1 divided by 7. We've also thrown in some 1 divided by 49s and some 1 divided by whatever 7 to the power of 4 equals and stuff like that. So here, these 1 divided by 49 or 7 to the power of 2 or 7 to the power of 4, these are totally unconvincing. And the reason they fail is because you're adding specificational resources. Look, the specification Shabir Ali gave is quoting that Quran verse about the multiple 7. And again, it's debatable whether that is actually specifying multiples of 7 will be found in the Quran or not, but let's grant that. Okay, great. So the number 7 is finding multiples of 7 has been specified. We're just going to assume that for the sake of argument. Well, now you're on top of that, you're specifying 7 to the power of 2 or 7 to the power of 4 and results related to that. Well, that wasn't justified specification. So now you're adding in different specificational resources and those in turn have to be justified as well. And I think that the Muslims just don't do that. They just see, well, the number 7 is involved. Yeah, but it's not enough for the number 7. Yes, I get it. It's an exponent, 7 to the power of 2. But you were specifying like multiples of 7 in the simplistic sense before. So now you're kind of changing the parameters of what specifications count as a hit without any due justification. I haven't seen why we should expect that. Like why if we get 7 to the power of 5, is it all exponents or is it only these specific ones that count as hits? If it's all the exponents, right, as you would think, because, well, it involves the number 7, so that's good enough. 7 to the power of 2, 7 to the power of 4. Hypothetically, if there was 7 to the power of 5, that would be a hit. If there's 7 to the power of 6, that would be a hit. So, but in the Quran, we don't find those. There are only a couple of exponents that we find. So why is that? Does that mean the Quran is failing to provide 7 to the power of 6 multiples, or 7 to the power of 3, or 7 to the power of 100? Why aren't these mathematical patterns found in the Quran as well? And you would have to justify that. And to my mind, I've never seen a Muslim provide that. So in this case, yeah, basically by throwing in these types of things, they're adding specificational resources to the list, which is only going to increase the probability that they would get the hits that they're finding there. So I hope that explains how to kind of assess the numerical patterns in the Quran and helps you guys out. At this point, I think that covers what I wanted to say. It was important to me to provide sort of a systematic methodology or understanding for how to evaluate or assess these patterns. Again, Shabir Ali, he himself isn't familiar with specified complexity, and he also kind of questioned it a little bit by saying, well, it's not popular or approved by most scholars. I would disagree with that. I think it is almost universally accepted, and in fact, Shabir Ali's some of the justifications he gave kind of speak to that, right? I mean, for example, he was, in terms of conditional independence, he was giving a lot of explanations to rule that out. Look, this isn't human design. Human beings couldn't possibly have known the patterns in advance and then inserted them like a self-fulfilling prophecy type deal into the Quran. So he's trying to aim at specification here. Same deal with tractability. He's trying to say, well, look, these these things were specified well in advance in these Quranic verses that he mentioned about 19 and 7, pretending his interpretation is correct. And it is, in fact, specifying that we will find multiples of 7 or multiples of 19. Again, that's debatable. But Shabir Ali's tackling specification, just like William Dembski says. And in terms of the complexity, this is just straightforward probability theory. You cannot deny this. This is the equation. If you want the saturated probability, which is what we need, you have to follow through with this. You'll learn this in any secular university thing. So I think Shabir's wrong. It would be wrong if he dismissed specified complexity as the proper criteria for judging this. Again, he wasn't committing either way because he's not familiar with it, and we have to be fair on that front. But I would just say, look, specified complexity is, the majority of experts reject it in terms of the creation versus evolution debate. That is a highly specific field of study, and there are reasons for that. I think it's biased, really. In terms of atheistic evolutionists and stuff like that, they're just biased against any intelligent design type thing. So I don't really care what the consensus means. The consensus opinion of experts is irrelevant because it's biased, provably and demonstrably biased against intelligent design. But even if it were correct, just because specified complexity isn't applicable to a given field in the proper way, it is applicable, right? But we would say that there isn't. William Dembski is incorrect in saying that there are instances of specified complexity in the field of biology, because the odds, no, well, look, we've got a lot of probabilistic resources. It's not complex, given naturalistic mechanisms like genetic mutation, genetic drift, whatever, and natural selection. That means that there's a very high probability that we will have the complexity of biological systems in this field or something like that. So specified complexity is still applicable there, but it's just the debate is over, well, is the DNA an instance of specified complexity or not? How small is that probability? And that's what the debate is over. But specified complexity applies to all other fields. I've given examples in my show on miracles outside of the field. Intellectual property protection, we use specified complexity to prove that. Mount Rushmore, finding messages or linguistic systems that have semiotic dimensions. So specified complexity is confirmed over and over again, in my opinion, in all disciplines and fields. It is the proper method to use this. So I would disagree with Shabir and say that this is, if you're going to claim there are numerical patterns in the Quran, this is the only way you go about proving that, regardless of debates in the creation versus evolution debate, where we try to say, well, does specified complexity work? Is it the criteria fulfilled in the case of certain biological organisms or certain biological aspects, like the formation of the DNA and stuff like that? So those debates where it's controversial is totally irrelevant to what we're doing here, and I stand by it. So I hope that helps, and I've provided a helpful framework for how we might go about evaluating some of the patterns in general that Shabir has given us, and what's needed to seal the deal, so to speak, to falsify or verify that there are these numerical patterns in the Quran, and number two, that they are significant. They do prove, on a balance of probabilities, intelligent design, non-human intelligent design, presumably, given the religious context, God is in fact at play. So yeah, that's my take. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.